At the end of World War II, the United States made a deal with the devil. Not metaphorically, a literal transaction. A negotiation between American intelligence officers and the men responsible for some of the worst atrocities in recorded human history. The terms were simple. The Americans would ask no questions, would file no charges, would offer complete immunity from prosecution. In exchange, they would receive something they wanted very badly. Data. Scientific data collected over more than a decade of human experimentation. Thousands of subjects, hundreds of experiments. Results obtained through methods so brutal that no ethical framework in any civilization at any point in history would have permitted them. The men who collected that data never stood trial. They returned to civilian life in Japan. Some became professors. Some became doctors. Some ran pharmaceutical companies. One became the governor of Tokyo. The data went to American military researchers, and the world, for decades, was told very little about any of it. This is the story of Unit 731, a story about what happens when the machinery of a modern state removes every constraint on human behavior in the name of military necessity. About the men who ran it, the victims who died inside it, and the government that chose to protect the perpetrators rather than honor the dead. It is not a comfortable story. It was never meant to be. To understand Unit 731, you need to understand Japan in the 1930s. Not the Japan of cherry blossoms and ancient temples. The Japan of imperial expansion, military dominance, and a state ideology that placed the emperor above all human considerations, and the Japanese above all other peoples. By 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria, the northeastern region of China, and established a puppet state called Manchukuo. It was a colonial project dressed in the language of liberation, governed by Japanese military administrators and supplied by Japanese industry. And it was far enough from Tokyo and from Western observers to do things that could not be done at home. This is where Shirō Ishii comes in. Ishii was a military physician. He was brilliant, ambitious, and possessed of the particular combination of ideological certainty and moral vacancy that history has repeatedly proven to be among the most dangerous qualities a human being can have. He had an idea. Biological warfare, the weaponization of disease, had been prohibited by the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Most military powers nominally respected that prohibition, at least publicly. Ishii believed this was a strategic mistake. He had studied epidemics. He understood that disease could kill more soldiers than bullets. He believed that the country that developed effective biological weapons and effective defenses against them would have a decisive military advantage. And he believed that developing those weapons required something that no ethical laboratory could provide. Human test subjects, living human beings on whom pathogens could be tested, experimental surgeries performed, physiological limits explored, and new methods of killing refined with the precision of controlled scientific experiment. He took his idea to the Japanese military. They gave him everything he asked for. Construction of the facility began in 1935 in Pingfang, a district outside the Manchurian city of Harbin. What was built there was extraordinary in its scale and its concealment. On the surface, it was presented to the local population as a lumber mill, a mundane industrial facility, nothing worth noticing. Inside, it was one of the most sophisticated biological research complexes in the world. Laboratories, animal housing, production facilities capable of generating hundreds of kilograms of biological agents per month, a landing strip, housing for thousands of staff, and the component that made everything else possible, the prison. Known internally as the Rho Block, it held the men, women, and children who would serve as the raw material of Ishii's research program. They were called Maruta, logs. The staff referred to their subjects as logs. It was a deliberate choice of language. Dehumanization is always a deliberate choice. If the people in the cells were not people, if they were material, biological substrate, raw data waiting to be extracted, then what was done to them was not a crime. It was science. The subjects were primarily Chinese, also Russian, Korean, Mongolian. Some were civilian prisoners. Some were soldiers captured in the field. Some were people arrested by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, on charges real or fabricated. Some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. None of them were told what was going to happen to them. None of them left. What happened inside Unit 731 is documented, not in rumors or in the testimony of survivors alone, though survivors testified. It is documented in the records of the facility itself, in the confessions of perpetrators captured by the Soviet Union after the war, in the research publications of scientists who worked there, and in the findings of investigators who pieced together the evidence over decades. The experiments fell into several categories. The first was disease research. Subjects were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, dysentery, and other pathogens. They were infected through injection, through contaminated food and water, through exposure to infected insects, through wounds deliberately opened and then contaminated. The purpose was to study how these diseases progressed in the human body, how long until symptoms appeared, how quickly the subject deteriorated, what interventions, if any, could halt the progression, and how effective different delivery mechanisms were for spreading disease to enemy populations. Subjects were typically kept alive as long as possible to maximize the data collected. When they died, autopsies were performed to document the internal damage. The results were recorded with the meticulous precision of any scientific study. Then the next subject was brought in. The second category was surgical experimentation. Subjects were subjected to surgeries performed without anesthesia. This was not oversight or resource limitation. Anesthesia was available. The decision not to use it was deliberate. The researchers argued that anesthetic compounds might contaminate the results they were seeking. Organs were removed, limbs were amputated, sections of stomach, liver, and brain were excised while subjects were conscious and restrained. Blood was drained and replaced with other fluids, animal blood, saline, seawater, to study the physiological effects. Subjects were subjected to live vivisection, surgical exploration of living, conscious human beings, to observe the functioning of organs in real time. The records describe these procedures in the clinical language of scientific documentation. Heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory response, time to loss of consciousness, time to death, numbers on a page, logs being processed. The third category was weapons testing. Unit 731 needed to know not just how pathogens killed, but how effectively they could be delivered as weapons. This required field testing, experiments that took place not in laboratories, but in the open air, on terrain that simulated battlefield conditions. Subjects were tied to stakes in outdoor test areas. Biological bombs were detonated at measured distances. The researchers observed and recorded how many subjects were infected, how quickly, and at what distances the weapons were effective. Grenades packed with plague-infected fleas, bombs filled with anthrax spores, artillery shells designed to disperse cholera bacteria over wide areas. Each was tested on living human beings who had no choice, no knowledge of what was being done to them, and no possibility of survival. The data was recorded. The bodies were disposed of in the facility's crematoria. The fourth category defies easy categorization. It can only be described as the systematic exploration of the outer limits of human physiological endurance, experiments conducted not because they served any clear military purpose, but because the men running them could. Subjects were placed in pressure chambers and subjected to conditions designed to simulate extreme altitude. The point at which eyes rupture under insufficient atmospheric pressure was documented. The exact pressure at which intestines protrude through the abdomen was recorded. Subjects were frozen, limbs and entire bodies, to document the progression of frostbite and hypothermia. The process of tissue death under freezing conditions was mapped with precision. When frozen limbs were thawed, researchers beat them with sticks to assess the extent of damage. Subjects were deprived of food and water for extended periods. The physiological progression of starvation and dehydration was documented in detail. Subjects were spun in centrifuges to determine the rotational forces that cause death. Subjects were exposed to X-ray radiation in doses calibrated to produce different levels of damage, and their deterioration was documented over days and weeks. And stop for a moment. Because what needs to be understood, what makes Unit 731 qualitatively different from ordinary wartime atrocity, is not just the scale of the suffering inflicted. It is the intellectual apparatus surrounding it. These were not soldiers killing in the heat of battle. They were not guards brutalizing prisoners out of sadism or indifference. They were scientists. They wrote papers. They presented findings. They built on each other's work. They debated methodology. They sought to improve their results. The full machinery of scientific inquiry, hypothesis, experiment, data collection, peer review, publication, was applied to the torture and murder of thousands of human beings, and the results were considered valuable enough that when the war ended, one of the world's most powerful governments decided they were worth protecting. Unit 731 was not the only facility of its kind. It was the largest and most sophisticated, but the Japanese military operated similar programs across occupied Asia. Unit 100 near Changchun focused on veterinary biological agents, pathogens that could destroy enemy livestock and food supplies. Unit A, 1644 in Nanjing. Unit 8604 in Canton. A network of facilities connected by a shared ideology and a shared conviction that the people they were experimenting on were not fully human. The scale of Unit 731 alone is estimated at between 3,000 and 10,000 deaths. Some estimates go higher. The uncertainty reflects the fact that the Japanese military destroyed much of its documentation in the final days of the war, a deliberate act of concealment that was only partially successful. What could not be destroyed was the knowledge in the heads of the men who had conducted the research. And that knowledge was exactly what the Americans wanted. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The war crimes tribunals convened in Nuremberg and Tokyo. German officials were prosecuted, convicted, and in many cases executed. Japanese military and political leaders faced similar proceedings at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. But something was happening behind the scenes at the Tokyo Tribunal that only became fully understood decades later. American military intelligence had learned about Unit 731 very quickly after the Japanese surrender. Investigators had visited Pingfang. They had found the ruins of the facility, hastily demolished, inadequately destroyed, and understood what had happened there. They had also identified Ishii and the senior staff of the program, and they had made a calculation. The Soviet Union was already emerging as the primary strategic threat to American power. The Cold War was beginning even as the Hot War was ending. Biological warfare, its development, its delivery, its defenses, was going to be a component of that competition. The data that Unit 731 had collected on plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, and dozens of other pathogens had been obtained through methods that Western researchers could never ethically replicate. The scale of human experimentation, the number of subjects, the range of variables tested, it represented a data set that would take decades and enormous resources to recreate through any other means, if it could be recreated at all. The Americans approached Ishii and his colleagues. The negotiation was not complicated. Immunity from prosecution in exchange for the complete data archive of Unit 731. Ishii accepted. The details of this arrangement remained classified for decades. It was journalist John Powell in the early 1980s who first brought sustained public attention to the immunity deal. Powell had himself been tried, unsuccessfully, in the early 1950s on charges of treason, in part because of his reporting on germ warfare. The irony of the American government prosecuting a journalist for covering war crimes it had helped conceal was not lost on observers. The American government's position for decades was that no deal had been made, that Unit 731 had simply not produced evidence sufficient for prosecution, that the decision not to charge its members was a legal determination, not a political one. This was false. Documents declassified over the following decades made the nature of the arrangement unmistakably clear. American investigators had specifically recommended immunity for Ishii and his colleagues on the grounds that the scientific value of their data outweighed the interests of prosecution. Edwin Hill, chief of the Basic Sciences Division at Camp Detrick, the American Biological Warfare Research Center, wrote explicitly that the data obtained from Ishii's group was of great value and represented information that cannot be obtained in our own laboratories because of scruples attached to human experimentation. Scruples attached to human experimentation. That phrase contains the entirety of the moral calculus that produced the immunity deal. The Americans had scruples, the Japanese had not. The data existed because the scruples had been abandoned, and the Americans wanted the data. Therefore, the men who had abandoned the scruples would not be prosecuted. Shirō Ishii died in 1959 of throat cancer. He spent the post-war years in relative obscurity, moving between residences, giving occasional interviews to American researchers, and, according to some accounts, continuing to do some consulting work related to biological defense. He was never charged with a crime. He was never publicly identified as a war criminal by the Japanese government. He was buried with a funeral attended by many of his former colleagues. Other senior figures from Unit 731 did significantly better than obscurity. Masaji Kitano, who succeeded Ishii as commander of Unit 731, returned to Japan and became a prominent figure in the pharmaceutical industry. He co-founded Green Cross, which became one of Japan's largest blood product companies. Shiro Kasahara became a professor of microbiology. Ken Yuasa, a physician who participated in vivisection experiments, eventually confessed publicly to what he had done, one of the very few Unit 731 members who ever did. He spent his later years advocating for acknowledgement and apology. Most did not. Most simply returned to their lives. And in many cases, the professional networks and scientific reputations they had built, partly on research conducted at Unit 731, continued to open doors for them in post-war Japanese society. The victims received nothing. The families of those killed inside Unit 731 received no official acknowledgement from Japan for decades, no reparations, no formal apology. In many cases, no official confirmation that their relatives had even been taken to the facility. Survivors, those who had escaped the facility or been released before it was dismantled, faced a particular cruelty. Their stories were difficult to tell. In China, which had been occupied by Japan, the wounds of the war were complicated by the civil war that followed, and by a political system that had its own reasons to control the narrative of the past. In the Soviet Union, some of the captured Unit 731 researchers were tried and convicted in the Khabarovsk war crime trials in 1949. The Soviets made extensive use of the trials for propaganda purposes, which made Western governments even more reluctant to acknowledge the underlying reality, since doing so would validate Soviet claims. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that the full history of Unit 731 began to be publicly documented in Japan itself. The work of historians like Sheldon Harris in the United States and Shiro Honda in Japan slowly forced the evidence into public discourse. The Japanese government's response has been one of the most studied examples of historical denial in the post-war world. For decades, Unit 731 was not mentioned in Japanese school textbooks. When it was eventually included, it was often in language so minimizing as to be nearly meaningless. Official apologies for the Pacific War were repeatedly offered in forms so carefully hedged that they satisfied neither Japan's neighbors nor historians. The specific crimes of Unit 731, the human experimentation, the biological warfare, the immunity deal, were rarely if ever addressed directly by official Japanese statements. The argument made by those defending Japanese government policy was that the question of what was taught in Japanese schools was a matter of Japanese sovereignty, that Japan had apologized in various forms, and that continued demands for more specific acknowledgement were politically motivated. The argument made by the victims, their families, and the historians was simpler. What happened at Unit 731 was documented. The perpetrators were identified. The deal that protected them was documented. The failure to prosecute was a choice, and choosing not to fully acknowledge that choice, in textbooks, in official statements, in the treatment of the victims, was itself a choice. The question of what the American government should have done is not simple. The Cold War context was real. The Soviet threat was real. The interest in understanding biological warfare, both for offense and defense, was rational from a narrow strategic perspective. But narrow strategic perspectives have a way of producing consequences that extend far beyond the original calculation. The immunity deal for Unit 731 researchers sent a signal that was received clearly by war criminals around the world. If you have something the Americans want, you can negotiate your way out of accountability. It contributed to a pattern, visible in the recruitment of Nazi scientists through Operation Paperclip, in the protection of intelligence assets with bloody histories, in the Cold War pragmatism that consistently prioritized strategic advantage over accountability, that shaped the moral credibility of American foreign policy for decades. And it left a specific legacy in biological weapons research. The knowledge obtained from Ishii and his colleagues went into American research programs. Exactly how it influenced those programs, exactly which experiments built on the Unit 731 data, exactly which developments in American biological warfare capability owed something to the research conducted on thousands of murdered human beings, has never been fully disclosed. Because the documents that would answer those questions remain classified. There is a building in Harbin, China, that has been converted into a museum. It stands on the site of the original Unit 731 facility. Some of the original structures survived: the boiler house, parts of the administrative complex, the ruins of the main experimental block. Visitors walk through the ruins and the reconstructed spaces. They see the equipment, the cells, the documents, the photographs. The museum receives more than 100,000 visitors per year, mostly Chinese. Japanese visitors are relatively rare. This asymmetry between the societies where this history is remembered and the society where it occurred is itself a historical fact. Memory is never neutral. What a society chooses to remember, how it chooses to remember it, and what it chooses to forget are among the most consequential decisions any society makes. Japan's relationship with the history of the Pacific War is a subject that entire libraries have been written about. It is not a simple story of denial. There are Japanese historians, journalists, and educators who have dedicated their careers to documenting what happened at Unit 731, at Nanjing, across the arc of imperial expansion. But the official Japanese relationship with that history, the textbooks, the statements of politicians, the visits to Yasukuni Shrine, where Class A war criminals are enshrined alongside other war dead, has remained contested in ways that continue to define Japan's relationships with China and Korea decades after the war ended. And the specific story of Unit 731, the immunity deal, the American role, the way scientific data collected through atrocity entered the mainstream of Cold War research, remains under-acknowledged not just in Japan, but in the United States as well. Now stop, because there is a dimension of this story that goes beyond the historical. Unit 731 is often discussed as a unique event, an extreme case, a product of specific historical circumstances, Japanese imperial ideology, wartime dehumanization, the particular moral vacuum of the Manchurian frontier that cannot recur. The evidence does not support that comfort. The conditions that produced Unit 731 are not historical anomalies. They are recurring features of human societies under specific pressures. The combination of ideological certainty, the belief that the ends justify the means, that the subjects are not fully human, that the knowledge being sought is important enough to override ordinary moral constraints, with institutional power and distance from accountability, is a pattern that has appeared repeatedly across different cultures and different historical moments. The experiments conducted on black Americans at Tuskegee, where men with syphilis were deliberately left untreated for decades so researchers could study the progression of the disease. The radiation experiments conducted on American citizens without their consent during the Cold War. The enhanced interrogation programs of the post-9/11 era, where legal frameworks were constructed to permit practices that international consensus classified as torture. These are not equivalent to Unit 731 in scale or brutality, but they share a structural feature. They were authorized by institutions, conducted by professionals, justified by the argument that the information or security benefit outweighed the harm to the individuals subjected to them. And in each case, accountability, when it came at all, came late, incompletely, and in forms that satisfied neither the victims nor the requirements of justice. The lesson of Unit 731 is not that a particular nation or a particular era was capable of extraordinary evil. The lesson is about the conditions under which ordinary institutional processes produce extraordinary harm, and about the decisions, made in offices far from the harm, that enable those processes to continue. In 2002, a Japanese court ruled on a lawsuit brought by Chinese victims and their families against the Japanese government. The court acknowledged that Unit 731 had existed, that biological warfare experiments had been conducted, that civilians had been killed, and then it ruled that the plaintiffs had no right to compensation. The legal reasoning was complex, but the practical result was clear. The Japanese state acknowledged the facts and denied the remedy. This is not unusual in the history of atrocity. Acknowledgement and accountability are different things. States can acknowledge historical facts while simultaneously constructing legal and political frameworks that prevent any meaningful consequence from flowing from those facts. It is a form of resolution that satisfies the historical record while failing the people the historical record is about. The families of Unit 731 victims understood this perfectly. They had been waiting for something more than acknowledgement. They are still waiting. There is a final thing worth understanding about Unit 731. Not about the history, about the present. The scientific questions that Ishii and his colleagues were trying to answer. How pathogens spread, how they can be weaponized, how effectively they can be delivered against enemy populations, what defenses are possible against biological attack, are not historical questions. They are current. Biological weapons programs exist today. The Biological Weapons Convention of 1972, which prohibits the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons, has been signed by most countries but has no verification mechanism. It cannot be enforced. Countries that want to maintain biological weapons programs can do so in ways that are difficult or impossible to detect from outside. The knowledge that Unit 731 generated, obtained at the cost of thousands of lives, is part of the accumulated scientific understanding that shapes current research in both legitimate public health contexts and in the classified defense research programs that most governments maintain and that most governments do not discuss publicly. The men who died in Pingfang contributed, involuntarily and without consent, to a body of knowledge that is still in use. That is the longest shadow cast by Unit 731. Not the individual crimes, not even the immunity deal, but the way that knowledge obtained through atrocity becomes absorbed into the normal functioning of institutions, sanitized, declassified in pieces, cited without attribution, used without acknowledgement, until its origins become impossible to trace and therefore impossible to confront. We do not make this story comfortable. We do not tell it to condemn Japan, or to condemn the United States, or to score points in contemporary political debates. We tell it because it happened, because the people it happened to deserve to have it told, and because the mechanisms that produced it, the dehumanization of subjects, the institutional authorization of harm, the strategic calculation that protected perpetrators, are mechanisms that human societies remain capable of producing. Understanding them is not an academic exercise. It is, in the most practical sense, a form of defense. Maruta, logs. The men and women who died in Pingfang were not logs. They were people with names, with families, with lives that were taken from them by an institution that needed to believe otherwise in order to do what it did. Their names were not all recorded. Their individual stories were mostly not preserved. But they were people. And that fact, the most basic fact, the fact that required the most elaborate machinery of ideology and language to suppress, is the fact that this story insists on. Whatever else you take from this, take that. Subscribe and leave a comment below. How do you think history should handle the legacy of knowledge obtained through atrocity, when the crime that produced it can never be undone? There is no easy answer, but the question deserves to be asked. See you next time.